Introduce our guest speaker today. Bill Hager has been in the child care field his entire life, and he is my mentor, and it is through Bill that I've learned about the importance of early childhood education from 0 to 5, when the kids are really putting together all the tools they need, is when they need the most help from us. And Bill has spent his entire life doing that and now advocates for stronger rules and laws and guidance and things for our children. So, Bill?
I'm going to start by saying, for what it's worth, anybody here do public speaking? One of the things that happens to me, at least, is that when I'm introductions happening, and Becky, I realize I have nothing in my head whatsoever. It, however, has never stopped me. So, let me start, before I hand anything out or start with stuff, let me start with a little bit of why I do what I do, and my personal story, personal journey, so to speak. I started in human services like in 1407. I've been doing this almost really old. But I started working with troubled adolescents. That was where I got into human services. I worked when I was a teenager. It was very popular back in the day, back in the 60s, which was a drug crisis line where you'd be available for people with not just drugs, but primarily people who were teenagers going in crisis could call up and talk to a peer. From there, I got into working at a group home for emotionally disturbed adolescents. And first of all, realizing early on that if we could turn a child who was a negative force in the community to a positive force, what a phenomenal cultural shift that can be, which is why many of us are in this field. But what I realized too, working with these adolescents, is how limited our success rate was. That the number of kids that we were able to actually turn at 14, 15, 16 was a relatively small percentage. So I started personally looking for how I could make a difference. And my journey took me to younger and younger children in the context of the family. So now I'm working in child care where I'm working with children and families, birth to 5, because I found that's where I can make the biggest bang for the buck. What's been interesting is in the last 10 years or so, there has been this whole science called early brain development, which has codified, which has reinforced my personal experience. I'm going to hand this out because I'm very low tech, but some people do really value going and following stuff along on paper. So we're going to have a handout. Let me start by saying, why is it important? Now, I'm not going to get into, there's stuff in here, and we can get into it if you're interested. We can geek out on this stuff really easily. But we're going to start by talking about what early brain development. Now, we can give not to use the cliches. It becomes cliche almost, but 90% of the physical brain is developed in the first 5 years. That doesn't mean that the brain stops developing, but 90% of the physical structure of the brain are established in the first 5 years. The second piece about that is that the brain is a really fascinating organ, different than any other, because the brain doesn't develop through physical activity, like your heart or your diaphragm or your biceps. The brain literally develops its structures through the interactions the individual has with the world around him or herself. It seems bizarre, but it's true. It's counterintuitive because we don't think in that terms of body development. When we think of body development, we think about nutrition, we think about exercise, we think about those exposure to the elements. And all of those have an effect. But the brain structure, the physical structures of the brain, are established through interactions with your environment. So a child, 2 children, genetically identical twins, born to the same family. One is put into a stimulus-rich environment with appropriate interactions, with good, what they call calm response, where there are adults and other people around, they can say, hey, Becky. Becky goes, hey, Bill, back and forth with that young age. Second child is in a very stimulus deprived environment or a high stress environment. You take those two kids at 5, their brains are fundamentally different. And at 5, they stop changing. So an example of this, and I'm not a clinician, so don't hold me to this, but for instance, we all know about clinical depression, right? Informed group. Clinical depression, where the brain produces a chemical called serotonin, and there's a structure, a physical structure, that reabsorbs the serotonin so you're not too happy all the time. It's a bad thing. So there's a fail-safe in your brain. Sucks up the serotonin, so you have a balance. A child, now, when you are clinically depressed, that structure in the brain sucks up too much serotonin. So the brain chemistry is imbalanced. And we address for that by prescribing medications which are called
SSRIs.
Which are serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So it says we're going to stop that reuptake. That structure is one of those things that are established in the first 5 years. Now there are some genetic markers for that. I'm not saying that it's all environmental, but there is an environmental component to that structure of the brain, and if it's overdeveloped, then you can create a chronically depressed child. There is also social actions that are going on. Absolutely. And the third thing about the first 5 years, which I think is really important and we often overlook it, it is when the family systems are established. So if you're working with a troubled family, for instance, I'm looking at folks here who do, many folks here do, and they're having problems with their 14, 15-year-olds, and you look at the family dynamic, and there is a lot of sarcasm, there's anger, there's dysfunction in the relationship. Where did that begin? Did it begin at 13? When did it begin?
Ages 1 to 5.
Exactly. That's when the dynamic, the family dynamic, is established in the first 5 years. So if we wait until the child is 5, we've lost all the child development, we've lost the brain development, we've lost the family dynamic, and if you look at it, forgive me, I really don't like ticking people off, but I have a tendency to do that. So if I offend you, I've done something right. Because it may, but here's the deal. If we look at, talking about my experience, and putting it back in the world, at the success rate of disturbed children, of children who are having emotional disorders, and we look at from birth to 5, to 7, to 9, 13, 16, 17, what is our success rate as the age goes up? Our success rate goes up. If we have not turned a child, the term I use back in my social working days, if we haven't turned a child by the time that they are, say, 9 or even 5, the odds of that child being turned goes down. If we wait till 9 and they're not turned, do their odds improve or go down?
Decline.
They decline. If we don't, every time they hit another emotional developmental stage, our best chance at turning a child or a family who is dealing with dysfunction is in the first 5 years, because that's when you have the tools to do it. I often, when I talk about this, I am not a gardener. My wife is. My wife is a fierce gardener. I basically move dirt. I move dirt and I cook vegetables, so we have a good symbiotic relationship. But if you talk to gardeners, what is the only time, if you want to grow healthy tomato plants, what is the most important time of that tomato plant?
Right now.
The first planting. If you have a stunted tomato plant, and when it's just putting down roots, and the roots can't suck up appropriately, that's a structural flaw. That tomato plant will never bear the healthy fruit that you want it to. So the first 5 years, absolutely important. I'm going to go off this for a minute, and because we have some examples here. I'm not going to go too deep in this, but it gives you some stuff to look at later on. Quickly though, why don't we as a culture take those first 5 years seriously? Anybody have a theory? I obviously have many theories.
Well, I would say one of the theories is is that it's the domain of the nuclear family to do that.
Part of it, yep. I have two other things. Emotional memory begins at birth. So again, all those things that are hitting you, whether it be abuse, whether it be lack of stimulation, that's having an effect on you physiologically and emotionally. However, what I term hard memory, two-dimensional memory, structural memory, specific memory, that structure of the brain is established at, guess when? 5. So, I say this a lot of times, oh no, I remember when I was 3 years old and this happened. No, there are spot memories, but most of your hard memories begin at age 5. So we as a culture start believing that the child starts developing at age 5. Nothing else is happening. How many times, I can't tell you the number of times I've talked with a family about getting some work for their children, some health children, and they go to their pediatrician. The pediatrician says, wait till they're 5, then we'll worry about it. And I'm going, no, wait till, because the culture believes a child begins learning. Why do we start kindergarten at 5? Because that's when we remember ourselves beginning to learn. My second theory, and Becky's heard this, so she's been born for it. Second theory about why we don't take the first 5 years seriously is that when we in the community work with children, we always have to have a combination of what I call nurturing and stimulus. So if you're a kindergarten teacher, nurturing and stimulus. If you're a college professor, nurturing, there's some combination of those two. As the child gets older, what becomes more predominant? Nurturing or stimulus? As the child gets younger, what becomes more predominant? Nurturing. Right. What do we honor? So, the other piece of gender politics, what do we associate with stimulus? Masculine or feminine?
Masculine.
What do we associate with nurturing? Masculine or feminine?
Feminine.
What do we honor in this culture more?
Masculine.
So, we take that hard-edged stimulus, older child type of thing, and we respect it more than working with the younger child. Because we respect nurturing less than stimulus. We respect the masculine more than the feminine. I'm not saying that that's Bill's own theory, so don't go to church with that, but you can go to church with that.
Yeah, believe me.
She's already
We know about the man in the church.
One of my theories, though my theory is why we don't take the first 5 years seriously, is you're right, that is a family issue, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But we also don't take it seriously because we see it as the domain of the feminine. And we see it as, we don't remember it, so it can't happen. I got some stuff in here about brain development. I'm not going to go too much into that. Other than to say that the studies tell us, I'll go down a few here, the studies tell us that that the lack of our intervention with young children is costing our communities billions of dollars nationally. What is the number one, I'm looking at school folks, what is the number one inflationary spiral in public school budgets?
Special ed.
Special ed. What is the number one growth factor in special ed? Is it hearing loss?
No.
Vision loss?
No.
Behavioral health?
Behavioral health.
Developmental delays? Developmental delays, behavioral health. What are the two things that we can do have the most beneficial input into in the first 5 years? Developmental delays and behavioral health. So, we can make millions of dollars back in public health budgets alone by investing in those kids. The second thing, and I was listening, it's interesting, I listen to a lot of sports talk radio because the real news really depresses me sometimes. So rather than listen to real talk radio, and plus the fact that some of the people who call into political talk radio are really scary. Oh, there's a lot of force on it. There's a thing, if anybody has done that, there's a thing that came out just yesterday from Kurt Schilling's daughter, who was cyberbullied horribly. What we find is that the tools you need to both survive the bullying, but also to not bully. Because what are the roots of bullying? The roots of bullying is insecurity, right? Roots of bullying often is fear. It's not having a personal foundation. It's not having a sense of self confident enough to not do that. Those are the roots of those dysfunctions. What are the roots of substance abuse? I'm trying to fill a hole that isn't there. I'm trying to backfill. What are the roots of dangerous sexuality, early childhood pregnancy? I'm trying to fill a hole that isn't there. Where does that hole start? In most cases, because of the family dynamic and the personal development, it starts in the first 5 years. If you want to, the studies are phenomenal on this. And I won't get into too deep, but child abuse, I worked with the child abuse direct counsel for many, many years. It's very close to my heart. And we're always saying, it's so painful to intervene if the child has been abused. But the studies tell us there's a way to prevent child abuse, to reduce child abuse. And what is that? What is the best way to reduce child abuse? Put it another way. Who is the child most likely to be a victim of abuse? A confident child or a vulnerable child? The studies say that children who are raised to be confident, to be self-assured, to have all those qualities that you learn in the first 5 years, are less likely both to be abused or to be abusive. So in that level alone, we save billions of dollars in those kinds of interventions by having confident children. And where does that start? It starts in the first 5 years. Let me talk a little bit about Sanford families. Sanford families are a microcosm of the families nationally. So, is this a new thing? No. Our understanding of early brain development, our understanding of intervention with a young child and their families is not new. Although the science is better, so we have more knowledge now about it than we used to have. But what are the systems that are happening around that is impacting on those young families? And the first is economics. Now, people get really bored. Oh, economics, oh God, I'm going to take a nap now. I'm going to go to the bathroom. Economics. Let me put it in shorthand. The gap between a livable wage and median family income has grown and increased on a steady, not that they haven't gone together, the gap between the two have increased steadily and regularly for the last 40 years. So that, going back to my childhood, which is again back in the dark ages, there is nothing similar to family economics today as for my childhood. There is no parallel. When I say the two, I'm talking livable wage. I'm talking what you need, which is housing, food, medicine, clothing, transportation. Those 5. Those are the big 5. I could add education to it because education is also on a tremendous inflationary spiral. Going to college. But just those 5 for a young family, compared to what you earn, has gone up. The inflation spiral is much higher. So can one parent stay home and be a full-time parent anymore?
No way.
Less than 15% of York County families can do that. When I say livable wage for your, and some folks should know this because you've got the data. What is the livable wage for a two-parent, for a family of 3 in York County, approximately? Remember?
25,000?
No, that's one person.
Hourly, right?
Oh.
No, for a family of 3, it's close to $47,000 a year. That's either one parent and 2 kids or 2 parents and 1 kid. It's a 3-bedroom apartment. It's housing. It's heat. It's medical costs. It's insurance. It's cars. Even if we break it down to $40,000, that means one person has to make, for a family to stay home, one person has to make $40,000 a year when they're of the age of with a young child at home. How many people are being paid that in Sanford? Very few. So that has a ripple effect. Because not only does that mean that mom and dad both have to work, who else has to work? When you think of mom and dad working, what's the first thing? Forget where I work. Who's the first person you think is going to care for the child so mom and dad can work? Grandparents.
Yep.
Are the grandparents immune from the same economic pressures the parents have?
Nope.
Statistically, and people hate it when I say this, by the way. Statistically, if you are a woman of grandmother age, say you're 45 to 50 years old, you will work until you are 65. Statistically, that's true, either for the health insurance or for the wage, because you are not immune from the same pressures that the parents are. So grandmas, so not only does mom and dad both get sucked up into working, but their support system that we think is out there, aunts, neighbors, friends in the family, extended family, are being forced into the workforce. That's meaningful because we are not built to raise children by ourselves. We are pack animals. We require a community. That goes back to, I used to say child care, I used to think I'd laugh, but child care is the oldest profession. Because we raise children in nurseries since there has been children. There has never been a culture that hasn't raised children in nurseries. So what are natural nurseries, our families, our communities, our village, has gone away. And a lot of that's driven by economics. There also, and this is something we all know too, but just to point it out, the other parental pressure right now is what I wrote in the book, in the notes here, massive marketing and misinformation. Unprecedented. Now, I might put my foot in it because if there are people here who are avid anti-vaccination people, forgive me. The science says the best thing you can do is get vaccinations. Why are parents not doing that? Because of good science? Because their doctor says no, it's a bad idea? Why are people not doing it?
Irrational.
Because they read it on the internet. They heard it on the internet. I
didn't say as loud as you, but I did say
Did you say?
Fox News.
I tried really hard to be apolitical, but the point being is that conflict sells and the media buys it. Not all media, but many do. If you remember a couple years ago, the big thing about Tiger Moms, about you actually will be a better parent by abusing your children for breastfeeding. Oh, God. There was no evidence for that.
Yeah, say that again.
The Tiger Mom. There was a big thing on the internet, a big internet life. A woman wrote a book. They reviewed it on Fox News. That saying it was an Asian woman who said, the Asian culture are Tiger Moms. We don't coddle our children. We are tough with our children. We don't nurture them. If they're going to cry, we don't put up with that. And we make them succeed, and therefore they're very successful. But there is no science behind it. The science says that will create dysfunctional children who grow into dysfunctional adults. And it has tremendous life, and it had tremendous validity because it was on Fox News, it was on the Today Show, it wasn't just Fox News, it was on the Today Show, it was on the internet. Massive amounts of misinformation that is hitting parents up, and parents, because of the lack of that support system, are shot in the foot. They go, what am I going to do? So, we have this tremendous, invaluable period of time of life, birth to 5. 2, you have tremendous pressures on you as a parent. Some of it driven by economics, some of it driven by social, but tremendous pressure. And we have limited intervention systems to support those families because it starts at 5. And our real interventions for troubled youth start at 13. Not only, and again, I'm challenging you folks, because not only do we mostly start in high school or junior high, because that's when it becomes real enough for us to see, we don't even have that many family-based intervention programs for elementary school kids, and even less for preschoolers. So we start to wait for the problem to erupt. Low-income kids, of which Sanford has many, have even a greater hill to climb. We have built-in institutionalized poverty, institutionalized dysfunction, by not doing enough intervention with low-income, at-risk kids in the first 5 years. The one chart I have looks like this. I think is really important. There's a couple charts. This is one I think is really important. It looks like this. Mine's colored, yours isn't, because I don't have to pull it out here. But what it essentially says, that if you're on welfare, the number of words, the vocabulary that you're exposed to in the first 5 years is literally a quarter of that if you had a college educated kid. At the time when you need it, you're not getting it. Now I say that sometimes in welfare rights people really yell at me saying I'm being discriminatory before. I'm not. I've worked with low-income families my entire life. I have tremendous respect for low-income families. They're working really hard, but poverty sucks. Let's get down to it really. Poverty sucks. And if you're living in poverty, you've got a larger hill to climb than if you aren't. So our intervention with low-income at-risk kids is even more valuable and pays off even greater than our intervention with upper kids. Intervention with everybody helps, but low-income kids even more. Okay, so we have this cultural gap, we have this stuff happening. There are essentially 5 programs, 5 public systems that work with the young child in our community. In Sanford, in particular, in the culture in general, and Sanford in particular. But they all have a different point of origin, and they all have a different mandate. So no one of the 5 is able to meet the need. The collaboration between the 5 has great value, but no one of them meet the need. You have what's called child care. That's what I do. Child care developed in the community, not for the child. There's very little child point of origin of child care. Child care began because children were a barrier to mothers' employment. That's my field. That's where we started. That's not where we hopefully should go, but that's our point of origin. What the state and feds fund for me is not child support. What the state will fund is a program to reduce parent dependency on public systems. So they'll pay for the child to come to me if mom has to work. The child's need is not explored. So if the child needs to be out of the home, child care funds in the public systems won't pay for it. If mom has to work, I can get money to pay for the child, but not if the child needs it. So there's child care where mom can work. There is Head Start. Head Start is a phenomenal program, but people misunderstand it. Head Start is not an education program. Head Start was developed and given to a protocol from the feds to give children, low-income children, a Head Start online. It is to give them socialization, parental support. It's so they can have a medical home. And in fact, what people don't realize, unless you're really old like me, is that one of the major reasons Head Start was established in the first place was so we could feed low-income children. Because we could put the food program, and they could be in a place 4 days a week, 5 days a week, at least through the school year, and they could get subsidized meals and guaranteed to get that. They could have a medical home. That was the point. And then it got into the school readiness. The school readiness is only one component of a broader range. But A, it's for low-income kids, and B, Head Start funding does not accommodate working families. Head Start funding funds the part-day, part-year on-site program, which is great. I'm a huge Head Start fan. Okay, this is criticism. But when they passed welfare reform, Head Start alone became an anachronism. Because if you're on the welfare reform and you're low income, can you stay home? Not today. You have to be in a work-life experience 40 hours a week. So Head Start without child care ends up being something that a lot of families cannot access. We also have home visiting. Now, home visiting is really interesting. And I'm not a home visitor, so don't yell at me if I get something cut off. But home visiting, actually, at the point of origin, began as a child abuse prevention program. Because they found, similar to what I was saying before, well, the family system, is that they got into the idea is to get into newborn families, do an assessment, be a helping hand, eliminate the isolation, be a support, go into the home. So they aren't come to you, you go into the home, and you support that family. Phenomenal program. And right now, the way it stands right now, may completely be funded within the next 2 years.
Defunded.
Yeah. Yep. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but I really want to make a tip. The home visiting, again, has nothing to do with employment, nothing to do with education, it is family support. for all children. Now, Head Start does family support for its population. Home visiting does family support for anyone. Then you've got CDS, Child Development Services. Child Development Services is the early intervention program for Maine. What happened is that some years ago, the feds passed a bill called the Individual Disabilities Education Act. Now they passed that IDEA, or IDEA. Now they passed that because the Supreme Court beforehand said, a parent brought suit said, I've got a handicapped preschooler and I can't get any public school services, why not? The Supreme Court said, no reason for you not to. So eventually they codified it through IDEA. That says that part of is which talks about special ed across the board, but it also talks particularly about, it includes that the state education system has to accommodate the special ed needs of preschoolers, as well as public school kids. What Maine did is, instead of giving it to the public school system, because we have such an issue with density of population, they said we're going to regionalize it. So in another state with more people, like Illinois, that early intervention for preschoolers would be in the public school. In Maine, it's not, because Sanford, for instance, doesn't, the thought was Sanford may not have enough special ed kids to be able to put together an entire special ed program for all the hearing impaired. But if we take all the hearing impaired kids from York County and serve them under one roof, then we have enough density of population to do that. So CDS does that. The thing is, CDS is not required, it's an education program. So two things about CDS. One is that it does not, again, accommodate the working family. It doesn't have to. Its only issue is the educational attainment and the barrier to educational attainment for handicap. Then we have PreK. And PreK is a new thing. PreK is literally taking kindergarten for 4-year-olds. And that's very recent, but eventually it's going to be the law of the land. That PreK is here because public school was recognizing that, well, first of all, here's the ladder, that they were able to make a correlation between high school graduation rates and third grade reading scores. And made a second correlation between third grade reading scores and the entry-level screenings at 5. So if a kid screened badly at 5, he was likely to have bad scores in third grade and likely therefore not to graduate at 18. So we got to start earlier. But it's only for 4-year-olds and it's only for educational support.
I think everybody already knows this, but the Sanford Public Schools, no?
You know, it's worth saying, yeah.
That the Sanford Public Schools is going to have a pre-K program in September. I think a lot of people already know that, but toward what you're saying, it's a hopeful thing.
But to value the social emotional part of that is really hard. I mean, as a counselor in a public school, I have I don't have a lot of like-minded ways of looking at child development. Most people are teachers. Most people are concerned about the math and reading, which I am too, but I know that the social emotional component is the most important part at that age.
You got 3 issues, and there are 3 concerns. Now, pre-K is going to happen. That's guaranteed. We know that. Nationally, it's going to be a thing. There are 3 concerns that we have about pre-K. The first is that a 4-year-old brain is not the same as a 7-year-old's brain.
Nope.
So unless you adjust what you do, it will not succeed. In fact, it will have a negative impact unless you adjust what you do. The second problem is that, and I'm looking at the parents here, kindergarten sucks because I have to work. And only having 3 hours a day, having to worry about how do we do kindergarten around, how do we do work around kindergarten to a holiday, so the working family is actually harmed by some pre-K programs. And the third thing is, it generally, as you said, not only is it how the kid learns, but also it tends toward the academic. rather than the social, emotional, the physical. They did a national study a couple years ago about exclusion rates, kids who are asked to leave school. You might want to guess what the single largest exclusion population was nationally? 4-year-old boys. Wasn't 13-year-old boys throwing chairs. Wasn't 18-year-old boys who were smoking in the bathroom. It was 4-year-old boys. Does anybody else come to a conclusion of why that might be?
Because the expectations for them didn't match what they're ready for.
Yep. Now I've worked with preschoolers for like ever, and 4-year-old. This is not gender politics. This is development. There are a lot of, not all 4-year-old girls, but 4-year-old girls. There is a large percentage of 4-year-old girls who love to sit there and do that learning.
Yeah.
4-year-old boys, are they going to sit down? They can, but that's the primary thing. What do they really want to do? Run. Move.
Yeah.
Drive trucks.
Yeah.
Right.
And I will make a pitch. This is Bill's editorializing, so forgive me. This is my editorializing. But from everything I've seen, a 4-year-old who doesn't build with blocks will not read. There is a structure of the brain that happens. They also have done studies, 4-year-olds, 3-year-olds who do not climb, who do not go on the climbing structure, who do not jungle gyms, who doesn't hang upside down by their knees. The brain develops this way that they are not better, they are worse readers if they don't go out and run around, hang upside down, play in the swings. The brain systems work better if you do those, what we call play. But again, we don't honor play. And play is part of who we are. Look at the primates. Is there a primate group that doesn't play? Yes, ma'am.
I just think it's interesting that as a punishment, recess is taken away.
Right. Yep, exactly.
That's the craziest thing ever.
Exactly.
As a punishment in schools, recess is the first thing taken
Right,
away.
your homework's not done, you're staying in for recess.
Right. I mean, we really have that problem with 5-year-olds that you're describing with 4-year-olds. Ever since, I've seen it ever since we went to all-day care, is that, you know, we really got to look at the whole child.
Yep. Absolutely. And that's something else, is that those of us who do childcare realize that. We have kids for 10 hours a day. So we want to educate. If we do a good program, we want to educate. We want the kids to have number awareness, phonics awareness. We want them to have those kind of concepts down. But we have to also, we don't want to rob them of childhood, because that's what makes healthy adults. And if you think about it, look at your own kids. If you had to choose and say, what do you want for your kids? I want them to be successful, but you want them to be happy.
That's right.
You want them to be happy. So if my kid is happy and he's a greeter at Walmart, but he's happy, cool, I've succeeded. If he is, you know, the vice president of General Motors, but he's miserable, and he beats his kids, and he screams, and he yells, and he's divorced 5 times, but he's president of General Motors, have I succeeded? I don't think so. That's, again, Bill's editorializing. Forgive me. Forgive me. I have some slides here about this stuff, but a couple that I'm going to just talk to here. I'm going to skip down. I'm going to do 3 charts. They all say the same thing. So these 3 charts say the same thing in different ways. What they say is that if you look at our public investment, whether that be federal, state, or local, in children, against where their brain's developing, you'll see a really interesting story, which is that when the greatest brain development is happening, we're spending the least amount of money. That says that the 3 charts says the same thing. This one, a little silly one, but it also says if we do good with early childhood, this is what this national study says our return on investment is for our investment. I spend $1 on a good good early care education program, whatever that might look like. I get back $17 in savings. We did a study in Maine just recently that I won't bore you with, but people like me love this stuff. Codify, it's also true for Maine. That in reducing negative costs like special ed, and the increase in things like earning power and stuff like that, our return gets much better for the youngest child. By the time a child is in college, on the college track, he or she's successful failure is pretty much set. You get a kid into college, they're probably going to be okay. But yeah, we spend a whole lot of money. I'm not saying don't spend money on college. Don't hear me say that. I'm just saying that our investment down at this end doesn't give us as much of a bang for the buck as at this end. Let me just finish up here, two things. This is increasingly understood in the nation, nationally. This is increasingly understood on levels that I can't even touch. But it's also increasingly understood as a economic piece. And sometimes I get the argument. But the point being is that culturally we are still not there. We haven't reached the tipping point. And in sociology, people understand that they've done sociology. Tipping point is where you get a preponderance of evidence and the culture still doesn't buy it until you up to here and the culture buys it. The best example of the tipping point scenario or metaphor is smoking. Is that, and I look at anybody here who's older, I'm not sure anyone's as old as me some days. But when I was 40 years ago, I was still doing meetings like this. And 40 years ago, what would be on the tables?
Ashtrays.
Absolutely, across the board. And there was a lot of resistance. Smoking isn't that bad, don't that. Wait a minute, smoking's really bad. So the culture hit the tipping point. We have not, on early care education, on investment in the young child, hit that tipping point yet. My hope is that we will, because the evidence is really heavy. The evidence is really strong. But we haven't hit that tipping point yet. We're working hard to do that. Last thing I want to say, I'm going to hand out this, which is a quick one-pager on home visiting. Because everything I talked about, that's the one that's understood the least. And it's incredibly valuable. Like I said, I'm not a home visitor, but I think it's incredibly valuable. And it's being debated with. The federal funds are drying up because I don't know all the details, but the bottom line is that the Maine had to compete on the federal level for dollars, and the state of Maine application wasn't accepted, so we weren't able to get those federal dollars. So there is a bill in front of the state legislature to replace that with state dollars. And if you want more about that, talk to me after the meeting. I can give you more information on that. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about before I finish up is where is this whole piece in the Sanford Strong piece? Now, way back when, about 5-7 years ago, there was the Sanford Council on Young Child Wellness. That was a subcommittee of this group. Like a lot of stuff, though, that was funded through a grant. Grant went away, so we didn't have staff anymore. So there was a subgroup of this group that worked on that. The second thing is that as funds dried up for a lot of our programs, didn't go away, but they were reduced. They were reduced for not home visiting yet, but they were reduced for Head Start, they were reduced for child care, they were reduced for a couple of other things, that administratively people like me had less time for meetings. So we chose to say that there is a York County group that meets monthly that is sponsored to United Way, so they have staffing to United Way to make sure the meeting continue to happen. So we said we will go to those meetings for all of York County instead of Sanford specific meetings. Those county-wide meetings are still happening, and if you're interested, the contact information is on there. If there's interest in doing something in Sanford, the problem is going to be, again, there is less time for people like me, the Head Start rep, the home visiting rep, to go to too many meetings because, again, administratively we have less time on these staff. So whether we can recreate that here, I don't know. There is value to what I said earlier, which is the different disciplines in the community all touch one part of the child and family, but don't touch the whole issue, which has to be families, has to be kids, has to be educational, has to be social, has to be early intervention, has to do a number of things. Each of us do some of, but nobody does all of. And that's important to understand that piece, because when someone looks at a Head Start, a pre-K, a child care classroom, if they're well run, they look the same. That's all. It's must be the same thing. But they have very different mandates, and the funding does drive what we can and can't do. Right. So, as I said, and I'm very, because it is my prejudice because of looking at my field, but also looking at the community and the working family, that if we do anything that ignores the working family, then we will not be fully successful. If we do anything that ignores the fact that parents have to work, we're not going to be fully successful. And unlike working with teenagers, I'm not 100% sure we can be effective with teenagers without the family as a partner. But I know for damn sure we can't be successful with a preschool child without the parent as a partner.
That's right.
So that's absolutely essential for any early childhood program, that it not be for the child exclusively, that the child and family be a component of what we do. So that's where we are now. And I've opened up any conversation. We have a few more minutes left before my time is up. Any questions, concerns, comments, consideration, opinions? I love opinions. I love arguments.
Bill, when you go home at night and you fantasize about the one thing that if this community could do one thing to address this issue, what would it be? What would this community do that's remotely realistic? But
Okay, what I would, in that fantasy, my fantasy is that public school accommodate a broad range of learning style, and B, the working family. That would be my fantasy. I don't know if that's doable, but if it was, again, pre-K is going to happen. It can bring resources we've never had in the early childhood field. But if it doesn't accommodate the working family, it could have a net negative. Or if it doesn't accommodate the unique learning style of a young child, it could have a net negative. I'm looking at public school. I don't mean to look at exclusively. But if I could do
what does that
one
look
thing,
like in a working family? Like a pre-K program, what does that look like?
there are models across the country that do work. There are models across the country where pre-K has been put into child care centers.
Right.
So
You
that
mean for like after school time?
Right, or for instance, in Portland they do this as well. Not even across the country. In Portland, Catherine Morrill Day Nursery, which is an AC accredited program, they place a teacher at Catherine Morrill. The child gets dropped off at 7, mom has to go to work at 8. Pre-K is provided at Catherine Morrill and funded through the public school system from 9 till noon, 9 to 12:30. The child then is there for the rest, and then the child takes a nap, has lunch, takes a nap, gets up, plays in the playground, mom picks him up at 4 o'clock. That model of integrating public school into the community setting meets all those needs I'm talking about. If I have, on the other hand, and this is something else, and you public school folks know this, and parents know this, that one of the unfortunate realities of public school is that the bus company rules.
Yes.
So for instance, I have families who use my program. The families who use the program are alive, all that stuff. Cool. Bus company, even if they had a pre-K, and that's another thing I'm talking about. Pre-K.
Yeah.
If mom lives across town, but they're using me for childcare because I'm the accredited quality program, the bus won't pick them up in my program. Bus company will pick up and drop off them home, but not, because it's too confusing. But even then, that's another issue. And I'm going off on a tangent, forgive me, but talking about the perils of pre-K, and forgive me, I'm not anti-pre-K, but you have, this shows you an example of the perils of pre-K. For 4-year-olds, there is a car seat law for 4-year-olds.
Right.
Car seat law for kids in general.
Right.
Public school is excluded from the car seat law. Because the theory is that school buses are built in such a way that if it rolls over, the children are protected. They don't need to have seat belts, they don't need to have car seats for
How do
school
you
buses.
feel about that?
Is there science behind that with the buses?
Here's what the science, but here's what the science does say. If that is true, it is true for children of a certain size. It is not true for children who are too small. But yet, at this point, because pre-K comes under the auspices of public school, they don't have to have car seats to transport children. They're excluded from that law. It's a wonderful metaphor for saying that you have to adapt public school to the unique needs of the preschooler, and there is no requirement in statute for them to do that.
But yet it's illegal to transport a 4-year-old in your vehicle without a car seat.
Yes. Public school has, under statute, a number of liberties, and most of them appropriate, that you as a citizen don't have. There are things you can do in public school that are covered by blanket protection, that you as a parent don't have that same protection. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I think the school bus metaphor is an example of my personal concerns over pre-K, not adjusted to the needs of that population, then it can actually be a negative. Yes, ma'am.
Bill, how long does a pre-K day last? How many hours would a 4-year-old be in pre-K?
Depends on the model, but it's not required to be more than 3.5 hours.
So half day?
Half day.
I think the program, though, that Sanford is starting in September is an all-day, right?
Yeah.
But again, all day though has a different definition for working families than it does for a public school system.
Right.
Right, so it's like 8 to 3 as opposed to 8 to 5 or...
And I think we're trying really hard to pay attention to the social emotional piece, and particularly to the family piece. It's interesting that you asked Bill the question you asked him, because it's something I've just been pondering for years and years and years and years and years. When you look at and doing outreach and working with a lot of these families, and I look at the responsibility that's being asked of the public schools across the United States, really, to improve academic scores, to educate our kids in a more career-ready kind of way. And yet, the struggle, and this may be my myopic vision of being an outreach worker and social worker, where do we address the struggles that are taking place in the community for these families? Whose responsibility is that? And it was fascinating, David Brooks, who's a writer for the Washington Post and a Republican, who's also a brilliant, brilliant man, said that the Department of Education has this all wrong. We've all got it all wrong. Everybody's blaming the school system for not being the doctor, the lawyer, the physician, the therapist, the proxy parent for all these kiddos that are coming into our schools from these systems that are struggling. Where does the onus for our society lie for addressing that?
And I have a response to that.
Yay, run for president.
It has to do with, and forgive me for, this is one of Bill's perceptions. There is a historic culture in public school, and it has that culture is pervasive and goes back a long ways. And it has certain things to it. But one of them is, and I'll ask you folks in general, both the public school and community people, if you had to rate the public school system on its ability to collaborate with community partners, what grade would you give it?
It depends on the school. Yeah, it depends on the school.
I think you'd have to give the Sanford schools a good grade.
Yeah.
Sanford School's been trying, but historically, what I describe as putting the pre-K into an existing quality child care program has been the hardest sell I've ever seen, because we don't do that. We don't go outside the school. I'm saying is that's one of the barriers the answer to your question is that you shouldn't have to do it all by yourself, but you have to be open to giving up some control issues to the larger community, to your community partners. Again, in my field, I don't do speech therapy, but I have kids who need speech therapy. So what I do is I collaborate with someone who does it, and they come into my place. Does public school do that? Public school, in their culture, hire speech therapists.
No, we have speech therapies on the contract.
Right, but this is great, which is good and something I encourage. But the whole thing is give up some control and bring in community partners. That's something that Sanford Schools is working on. Our schools, our future. Rachel is very involved with that.
Yeah, we've given them very low grades, sorry.
No, but I'm saying that, I'm looking at Rachel for that, because she's working on that, as have you and other folks. But I think that is part of that new vision. But it is something that I think that the answer is to do more in that community. If we do this well, we want to partner with these other folks to do what they do well and bring them in. And Rachel had something, and then we'll go around.
Well, but mine was actually just, I'm thinking that, one of the questions before us as a coalition is, is there something we can do as a coalition to address these issues? And given the fact that Sanford is starting a pre-K program, and all these sort of, challenges, I would say, have been, have been surfaced. What if we started not just a sort of generic young child wellness, which is overwhelming, and but maybe it's a group of people that want to get together specifically around saying how can the parents and the community partner with Sanford schools to create a pre-K program that is is making sure that they're looking at the whole child, the working family, how, like to really understand what are the challenges for working families, and you can only do that if you have working families at the table.
Yep.
And I think that's one of the issues, is that policies are developed educational policies without the families at the table, and that's what we've been working for 3 years now to change. It's really hard, but maybe at this level, when it's a new program, and this coalition can bring in a work group, a task force that would work collaboratively in partnership with the schools as they develop this program, so so we don't go down a road where we're having unintended negative consequences for families.
I
just have a quick question. Have the Sanford schools in general, but public schools collaborate with the private schools?
Once again, it depends on the community, but and it's very community's perspective, and it's also part of the culture of the community. So the example I use from my past is that Biddeford, which has a strong, very strong French Catholic background, and the Catholic school, private Catholic school, was very much part of the community. They share resources a lot because the culture is such that they're there. You almost look at they share textbooks, they share funding, they share, and so that culture allows that to happen. The autonomy of the school system is very great. So each school system is allowed to develop what it needs to. There's a lot of autonomy there, so that's possible. And you have over here.
Yeah, I generally worked with a veteran population, and so the childhood development issues are not my forte. But I have been working with the Healthy Community Working Group out of the York County Community Action. There may be an opportunity right now. That group has spent a year or more with a grant identifying what in the community we want to tackle as a group. And there's grant money associated with that, and I think what the group has pretty much landed on was the impact of ACEs on the whole community. And so it may be an opportunity, because we're just starting to work towards what does that look like. This may be an opportunity to kind of tie these groups together, perhaps.
Yep. Do you know what ACEs is?
No.
ACEs is an acronym for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And what they say is that it's actually very specific. Where it does have a value to what I'm talking about. ACEs is this, and they have a tier, a group of adverse childhood experience. Abuse obviously being one, but lack of stimulation being another. A parent being divorced, substance abuse in the home. Those are all adverse childhood experiences. And what they find is that if you experience a certain constellation of those, you're likely to have both physical and emotional problems stemming from that early in life. And if we can eliminate or reduce adverse childhood experiences, we will have a physically and emotionally healthier group of adults in 20 years. For where I'm at, this insidious with the young child, because, as I said, two-dimensional memory not established till 5, emotional memory beginning at birth. So that children who experience ACEs, those adverse childhood experiences, between birth and 5, may not retain the memory of the experience, but they retain the scars of it. So when you go into therapy later on because of your chronic depression or your anxiety or your eating disorder, all of which are tied back to here, and you go, and the therapist goes, let's talk about what your traditional talk therapy, what yours. I can't talk about it because it never happened to me. I don't remember it. It's not in my brain, but I'm carrying the scars. We call it the burgled room syndrome. It's like you come home from somewhere out and your house is tossed. You never saw the burglar come in, you never saw him leave, but your house is a mess. Emotionally, your emotional house is a mess, but you never saw the person come in and actually throw stuff around. And the second thing is that for the young child in particular, lack of stimulation is as devastating an ACEs as active abuse, and people don't understand that. Children die from lack of stimulation. And people go, that can't happen. Yes. Children die. The brain gives up from lack of active stimulation in the first 5 years.
Atrophy.
which is scary as hell, because it's preventable, but yet it's something it almost sounds sci-fi, but it's a reality.
So just so that people know that all of the Sanford schools have student assistance teams within the schools, and the referrals to the student assistance teams are based on the ACEs work. That informed all the work that we've done in the schools. So any child that's experiencing any kind of difficulty, trauma, or challenge, or if we hear a parent struggling with something, the kid gets brought to that team, and then outreach or therapy or somebody is assigned to the family to try
The
to
last thing
help.
I'll say about ACEs is that what's frightening about ACEs, what they're finding in the studies, is that if that is the root of your dysfunction, then traditional therapies, even for the older children, often don't work. What they found, and it came out of eating disorders, is that they were treating eating disorders, and the therapies weren't working. And why not? Well, if it's rooted in that early childhood trauma, traditional therapies won't work. And actually, the therapy that does work is that has some sign of success. Is where the therapist takes you back to your early childhood and has you reimagine your path, reimagine your life without. What would happen if your mom did do this? Let's walk you through that therapy. It's almost regression therapy, which sounds like, again, fruity stuff, but some non-traditional. You need to go to a non-traditional therapy if that's the root of the dysfunction.
Right.
So it's really interesting stuff. But it is. But again, the two things is that early childhood ACEs worse than later childhood ACEs. And two, that it is that it's not always just the preventable stuff. The obvious stuff. One of my heresies, I try to practice heresy once a day to stay in practice, is that a childhood of chronic understimulation has more of a negative impact than a child who was beaten once. Because we're so offended by the child who was beaten. Horrible. I'm not defending that. But that's something that's more easily overcome than a childhood of lack stimulation. And that's my greatest fear. Is that families find child care because they have to work, and they find child care that's adequate for their working needs, but not stimulating the child. And we have a whole generation of kids growing up who are not challenging, they're not proactive, they're not strong in their own selves, and they're vulnerable to those other problems. So my time is up.
I just wanted to say that there are a couple of great ideas where we could get together, and if you want to come see me after, I will take down the names of the people who had some good ideas to get things together. And now I'll hand it over to Rachel for our next portion.
So yeah, if anybody is interested in pursuing any of these issues, and especially if it is around sort of incoming pre-K, at the locally in Sanford, at the coalition level, do please see Becky, maybe if you're willing to take names, that'd be great. And we'll see.
Tack on there, I believe North Parish is going to be having some pre-K classes.
Yes.
So that
That's
could
where
possibly be
it's gonna be
a
located.
place where kids that went there are kids who need before and after school care. So
And there's certainly space.
and there's space. So that's that just triggered.
Yeah.
I don't know where all the classes are going to be, but just think about that as a possibility.
Okay, that's so. Yeah, if anybody has interest, please see Becky. We have one piece of business we have to do in terms of the coalition. Some of you who are perhaps new to the coalition today. Currently, the Sanford Strong Coalition is funded. The staffing and support of the coalition comes from the Drug-Free Communities Grant that Strategies implements. And we are, the DFC comes to our first grant, the first 5 years comes to a conclusion in September of 2015. And we are in the process of reapplying for a continuation 6 to 10 year grant. And there's been a lot of input from the coalition in that, and especially the Drug-Free Communities Task Group, which is very actively involved in that reapplication process. But in order to apply, the coalition must have really a primary focus of substance use and abuse prevention, and that also must be in our mission statement. And we actually currently have a coalition mission statement that does not include that. So, let's hand these out. We are proposing a change in a small revision of our mission statement. And I'm just going to be going around. And I'll read it out loud, but those of you who like to see it visually, it should be before you soon. So the old mission statement says the Sanford Strong Coalition, a network of residents, organizations, businesses, and others invested in the future of Sanford, provides for the exchange of information and the leveraging of resources, an effort to identify community needs and create solutions that strengthen the health, well-being, and success of Sanford's children, youth, and their families. That's really a mouthful. It's quite a long mission statement. But it's been somewhat streamlined, and as you'll see in the new that we're proposing, says to provide for the exchange of information and the leveraging of resources in an effort to identify community needs and create environmental solutions that reduce youth substance use and abuse and strengthens the health, well-being, and success of Sanford's children, youth, and their families.
That's just the addition.
Yeah. Just everybody a minute just to take that in. Are there questions about that? Are there concerns, any feedback or comments of any variety?
Does it have to be, shoot, we were just saying, it says environmental solutions that reduce youth substance abuse. Does it have to be youth, or is it just substance abuse?
Well, that we do say youth because we have, over the course of the coalition's work over the last couple of years, decided that the coalition, in order to not just be too big, is really focusing on youth. Recognizing that you can't, as Bill was just saying, you can't focus on youth without also recognizing the family. But just being clear that the focus of the coalition, the parameter of the coalition is on youth. And then if we really open it up to, cradle through grave, as they say, then we're going to lose some of our, it's the mission threat. So I think that's why youth is in there. But clearly, and the DFC focuses specifically on youth.
If I might, it's also as a prevention, the grant is around prevention.
Okay.
So your best audience prevention is kids rather than returning vets, which is a valid concern, but it's not going to be as much prevention and the same kind of prevention as doing kids.
But good question, because that clarified that mission.
We can also codify through data that most people who have adult substance use problems began their experience as children. The vast majority were minors when they began abusing drugs.
Any other thoughts or feedback? So we don't really have a very official way of making decisions in the coalition. I guess we're going to vote. So all those who support this motion,
I make a motion that we accept the new mission statement.
I second the motion.
Excellent. All those in favor, please say aye. Raise your hand. All right. All those opposed? All those abstaining? All right. 100%. Okay, thank you for that bit of business. That will go in the minutes, and that will go in there. That we will be able to submit this revised mission statement with our application.